Hey everybody, what is going on? Hexlex here. Got another Master Duel video for you, and it's finally time to do our tier list for Season 28. Just had a couple of other videos I wanted to get out, like the, of course we can't miss viewer special on Monday, and want to do my tournament report as well, get that out. Usually I like to do the tier list, like, you know, more at the end of the season, going into the next one, but we're just a couple of days into the next season here. Also, do want to apologize if you hear any weird background noises. They're doing construction, like, quite literally right outside my house. I went out there and I was like, guys, hello, I'm making a YouTube video, but they didn't seem to want to listen for some reason, so no. But yeah, anyway, yeah, so a lot of people, I've seen a lot of comments asking about the next tier list, probably eager to see where everything ends up falling. A lot of the placements, or there's one in particular that's probably going to be to no one's surprise, but let's just go ahead and dive right into it. I'm just going to, I guess I will start by saying we have 30 decks that are go on the tier list here, between tiers 1, 2, and 3, as well as Rogue. These are 30 of the most represented decks according to, I pulled from both Untapped and Master Duel meta, just kind of like bounced back and forth. Also, on Untapped, I filtered for Diamond and Master rank, so these are going to be, I'm not solely basing it off of the order that they're on Untapped or on Master Duel meta. I'm just using that as my reference for what decks to include. These are going to go on the tier list in the order that I just feel that they are strongest, you know, from strongest to weakest in the current meta. As always ever, I want to say that just because a deck is in Rogue, that does not mean bad. Rogue does not equal bad. In fact, many Rogue decks very consistently top tournaments and hit Master 1. So every single deck on here, and many other decks that are also not on here, are definitely what I would consider to be good decks. If a deck can top a tournament or hit Master 1, I think it's a pretty good deck. I mean, what else do you really want a deck to do besides that, right? As always ever, I welcome discourse in the comment section, as long as we're not being rude. You know, disagreeing can be fun, but being rude is not. So anyway, let's go ahead and just dive straight into it. And rather than go in order, well, I will go in order for the most part, just starting from the upper left going to the lower right, but I'm going to pick out one in particular to start with, the one that I think everyone probably is most agreeable on, and that's just going to be Snake Eye being the best deck in the format. And I do think we are in a quote-unquote tier 0 meta. Now, I don't have an actual tier 0 on here. I feel like that would be kind of redundant. But basically what it means is that Snake Eye is going to be the only deck, probably, I'm going to throw an asterisk on that. I might change my mind later on in the video, but I would imagine that I can't think of another deck among these that are on the same power level that Snake Eye is currently. So Snake Eye, spoiler alert, is going to end up being probably the only tier 1 deck on this tier list, because I do think it is just far and away the best thing you can be doing in Master Duel right now. I think it was close before. Before Bonfire came out and the deck got that much more consistent, I wouldn't have necessarily agreed that Snake Eye was tier 0, and it might not even necessarily be tier 0 right now. I will say this much. If Snake Eye is tier 0 right now, which I do think that it is, it's not as powerful as Tearlaments was. The gap between Snake Eye and the next best deck in tier 2 is definitely not as wide as the gap between Tearlaments and, I don't know, whatever the next best deck was in that format. Sprite, probably some variant of Sprite. But yeah, no, the gap is definitely not going to be quite as wide here. I do think Bonfire does kind of push Snake Eye over the edge in terms, again, of consistency, which does make it just that much better and bumps it up to tier 0. You get to cut down on, like, the third Poplar, which was kind of awkward to open alongside Snake Eye Ash. The second Original Sin. I mean, this is at least stuff that I've been cutting. The second Original Sin, which was a little bit awkward to use sometimes if you had to, like, normal summon a hand trap. If you were playing Dramatic Snake Eye Chase, I think you definitely don't play that now. You never play Where Art Thou ever again, ever in your life, honestly. I mean, yeah, it's just, the deck just 100% was already the best tier 1 deck, and just got straight up improved, which I think does end up making it, I would say that this deck is tier 0 in this meta. So again, so probably the only deck actually up here in tier 1. It's going to be Snake Eye. So now we're going to go kind of in order here, starting with Kashtira as represented by a Riseheart. I think this is relatively high up on tier 2. Kind of the same thing I had to say about it last season. Like, it's got a really, really good matchup going into Snake Eye, the best deck of the format. Being able to play Shifter, a Riseheart is inherently very, very good against a Dimensional Fissure. Makes it extremely difficult for Snake Eye to play. So, on top of Kashtira already just being a really good deck, right? On top of that, rather, I keep saying that. But I think that Kashtira also being able to play a lot of hand traps is a huge factor. And I think not just in this meta, but in any meta, any deck that can be like half engine, half hand traps is going to open a lot of really good hands, regardless of if you go first or second, which is particularly important in best of one. It's one of many reasons why Snake Eye is as good as it is, right? It's got a lot of one-card plays, and therefore it can play, yeah, again, half your deck being hand traps or stuff like triple tack, call by, that kind of thing, right? So, and Kashtira does also share that strength. Of course, not being nearly as consistent as Snake Eye doesn't make it nearly as good. But I mean, it's still, of course, a tier 2 deck. And again, Snake Eye is standing far above the rest here. Dinosaur. I've definitely been seeing less and less of this as time has gone on. But that doesn't mean that Dinosaur is a bad deck by any means. I'm going to put it pretty firmly in Rogue. It'll probably be, if I had to guess, towards like the middle to lower end of Rogue. But again, being a deck that is on that end of the tier list does not mean that it is bad, as we do still pretty regularly see Dinosaur decks getting tournament tops here and there, and also, of course, hitting Master 1. Next deck I want to talk about is actually the Red Dragon / Resonator deck, which I think is doing better than I thought it was going to. I mean, I already classified it when it first came out. I was like, oh, this will probably be like a mid-rogue deck. That's probably about where it is, but I think it might even be... I'm going to put it towards the upper end of Rogue. Of course, it's right next to Dinosaur for now, but as more decks get placed, we'll also put them in order of where I think they go on the tier itself. But this is actually a lot closer to being a tier 3 deck than I initially thought it would be. And then also more than I think a lot of people realize too, right? The Red Resonator deck is another one of those decks that has a lot of one-card combo lines. It just requires more engine from what I've seen. Just glancing at lists, it doesn't seem like you have quite as much room for the amount of hand traps that a lot of other decks are able to play. Also, I've noticed playing against this deck that it does lose... I don't know about lose, but it is more difficult for this deck to play through a lot of disruption, including the Crimson Gaia, which is like their main spell searcher, is actually a continuous spell, meaning that if it gets destroyed, you won't get the search to resolve. So, especially going second, I've noticed it's harder for that card to be good, or be able to help Red Resonator decks get to their plays. Again, that's just my personal experience playing against the deck. I haven't played with it yet, but I'll call this upper Rogue. I think this deck did end up being stronger than I thought, and then maybe some other people as well. Mikanko, I've put this card in Rogue sometimes, but I think this is pretty firmly a tier 3 deck right now, and probably just in general too. Did I put it in Rogue last time? If I did, I shouldn't have, because the Infernoble package, I think I talked about this though, the Infernoble Knights, that whole deck coming out, offers a very, very good package for Mikanko, which was already a really good deck. The cool thing about Mikanko too is, like, a lot of people think of it as a going second deck, but there are a lot of variants and just ways you can build this deck where it's good to go first too. There's a lot of different engines you can play, like I said. It's got variety, it's got power. I think this is a pretty firmly tier 3 deck in this meta. And it also has another trap card coming out, but I don't know how relevant that is for the deck. Okay, let's see. Let's talk about Purrely a little bit, right? So, Purrely is a deck that is getting some new support. I believe it got leaked yesterday, if I recall correctly, that at Purrely Noir, the rank 2 version of X-Purrely Noir is going to be coming out in the next selection pack. So, what does that change for Purrely? Not necessarily a whole lot by itself, but we did also see that Happy Memory went from 2 to 3 on this most recent ban list. So Maybe that'll mean more unlimits for Purrely in the future, especially if that card ends up being a UR and Konami kind of wants to push it. I could see like maybe regular Purrely coming back to 3 on the next ban list as well. That'd be really cool, and honestly, I think the deck does deserve it, because it got hit a little hard, a little bit too quickly, in my opinion. I know a lot of people don't like playing against Purrely, but what do I think it is right now? See, this is kind of the tricky thing about Purrely, right? I don't want to evaluate it with Purrely Noir because I don't think we know at all when that's coming out for sure. So I think for the time being, I do have to put Purrely in a Rogue. It's actually probably about the same level that Red Resonator is, honestly, in its current state. They are getting the 3rd Happy Memory back this upcoming ban list, and again, once Purrely Noir, the rank 2 comes out, and hopefully we'll get another unhit for Purrely, alongside that, then we can see this deck come back up to the upper tiers and just finally see play again. It's like, when is the last time you even saw this deck, right? Well, I actually faced off against it in the Challenger Cup recently, but that's kind of besides the point. Infernoble Knight. Infernoble Knight, I think, much like Mikanko, is a very, very good tier 3 deck. I think the skill gap is a lot of what separates Infernoble from the upper tiers, right? Just the fact that this deck is... It can be very complex, and it can be very, you really have to be dedicated to it, right? I mean, that's true of every deck. The more dedicated to it you are, the better you will be with that deck, of course, duh, right? But Infernoble Knight is one of those decks where it can be a bit more tricky for someone who's never played it before to pick it up, but in turn, you are very, very much rewarded for learning the deck and playing it very well. Yeah, I mean, I think Infernoble Knight is a really fun deck. It's really cool. The ways that you can combo and the amount of lines are kind of insane, right? Like, I thought I had a pretty decent grasp on the deck, but then I posted my most recent deck profile, and people were, like, pointing out these lines that I could do, and I'm like, oh yeah, that would be just way better. Why didn't I do that? So it's like, it's one of those decks where you always feel like you're learning something new. At least I do every time I pick it up. Very, very good deck, like I said. This is actually a deck that's very close to being tier 2. It'll probably just end up being pretty high on the tier 3 side of the list. I think it's mostly just a power level thing, right? Like, the fact that you have to do long form combos kind of means that you're weak to disruption at various points, and yeah, I think, again, we see Snake Eye, which has more simplified lines and has also that same kind of powerful inboards. The other thing about Snake Eye's board is that it's more layered, right? Like the Infernoble Knight board, can be kind of susceptible sometimes to board breakers, like Droplet especially, whereas the Snake Eye board can potentially play through it a little bit more easily. So that's another thing that I think separates it, I guess really separates Snake Eye from a lot of other decks in the meta more than anything else, right? Okay, Mathmech. Mathmech, I think, is a very, very solid, very, very good tier 2 deck, actually. I'm going to put it at the upper end of tier 2. I think I will end up putting it above Kashtira. Not even for being particularly well poised against Snake Eye or anything. Like, I think that is... Like, I think if Snake Eye were less reliant on the graveyard, I could see a world where Kashtira, and maybe even some other decks that we're going to put on this tier list would be, like, a tier lower. But Mathmech, that isn't the case. I think Mathmech gets its tier 2 slot just from sheerly how powerful of a deck it is. Of course, with Circular still being at 3, it's pretty easy to see why. And I actually like the fact that Circular is at 3. It kind of makes it feel like there is other decks that have, like, more of a chance against Snake Eye. And I think it's why Snake Eye, of course, also the fact that Fire King isn't out kind of has to do with it a little bit too. But I think it's one of the reasons why Snake Eye doesn't feel like as much of a tier 0 deck in Master Duel than it does in other formats, mainly the TCG. But I have to emphasize as much of one because I do still think that, of course, it is a tier 0 deck. Adamancipator, just another one of those decks that just will consistently show up in tournament tops, and it's not a deck that's on a lot of people's radars. I've put it in tier 3 in the recent past, but I think I'm going to put it in upper rogue, but I'll even put it above Purrely, because really when it comes to results, right now, at the current moment, we do see Adamancipator, I think, putting up slightly more results than Purrely tends to. But again, this is before the Purrely Noir, and also before any more possible unhits. Again, I would really like to see the regular Purrely come back to 3, but as far as Adamancipator goes, it's just, I don't know, it's still just a very, very solid deck. I think it kind of has the same, I don't want to say issues necessarily, but It's the same thing with Infernoble Knights, where it's a long-form combo deck that puts a lot of disruption on the board, which means that it's not only more difficult to learn, but also can sometimes be more susceptible to board breakers than something like Sekai, which I think is why it ends up being down here in Rogue. But this is very, very close to Tier 3. There's a part of me that even still wants to put it in Tier 3, but I think I'll leave it in Upper Rogue for now. Okay, so Runick, this kind of covers a lot of Runick variants in general. Not necessarily Naturia, because that's going to be its own separate thing on the tier list, but this is like Runick Mill or Runick Stun for the most part. Well, I don't know, because Stun is also its own thing on the tier list here. But Runick Stun, to be fair, plays a lot differently than other Stun variants. I think either way, like I think, because I also kind of wanted to lump in Bestial Runick, but Bestial Runick and Runick Stun are two like very different decks. I think both decks end up being in a Rogue, so that's why I'll put Runick overall. I'll put it in like the same neighborhood as like Red Resonator, but maybe a little bit lower. Yeah, the Fountain one definitely hurts like really badly. Yeah, I don't know. It's like it's pretty much where Runick's at right now. As far as Fountain being at 1, because that's something that I've been really like gung-ho about being against right in the past, and I think I still feel the same way. I think Fountain could totally be at 2 and it would be completely fine. And I think especially in a format like this, right, where Fountain to 2 is not, in any format, in my opinion, in Master Duel so far, since its limitation, really, like, ruining anything, quote-unquote. But, like, again, especially with Snake Eye being as strong as it is, like, why not give a lot of other decks, like, the chance to be able to compete against it a little more easily, right? That's just my 2 cents on Runick. Alright, Sky Striker Ace Ray is going to be representing Sky Strikers as a whole. That's definitely going to be another kind of rogue bordering tier 3 deck. I kind of feel like it's in the same neighborhood as Purrely, honestly. Where it's one of those decks where it's kind of the opposite as Purrely in some ways, it's the same in terms of power level, and also the same in terms of like deck that once saw a ton of play that now doesn't really see any play, but not even because it's bad, just because there are other better decks to play. But whereas Purrely, that kind of happened to it because it got hit a lot, Sky Striker kind of just has a lower overall power level, where Sky Striker is actually been getting cards unhit over time, right? Like Kagari went from 1, or was at 1, and then went up to 2, and then 3. Widowacre, I think, also started in Master Duel at 1, and then went to 2, and then 3. But despite that, the deck, I think, still is just, you know, it's fine. You can definitely top a tournament or do well on ladder with it, but there are definitely more powerful decks out there. Yeah, I don't know. I think I was gonna say like a lot, if not every Sky Striker card could get unhit back up to 3, and the deck would be totally fine. Hornet Drones does get abused in non-Sky Striker decks, which I think is why it's at 1. But like if Engage went up to 3, I think that'd be a huge power boost for the deck, sure. But I don't think it would make it like tier 1 overnight or anything. Or I don't even necessarily think it would make it tier 3 overnight. Maybe tier 3 if Engage went from 2 to 3. But I think it'd probably still even be a rogue deck at that point. Yeah, still good, still fine. Definitely, for sure. Trap Trix. This is going to be another upper rogue deck for me. I think I'll put it in the same spot I've been putting it lately, which is just at the top of rogue. This one really, really comes close to boarding on tier 3. It's really cool that this is a trap deck, but it's also, it feels like more of a combo deck than Labrynth is. Like, Labrynth, of course, has plays and nuanced ones at that, but nuanced lab plays are more about like setting up a resource loop, whereas nuanced Trap Trix plays are actually like doing a combo line, which is really cool. I've always thought that was kind of cool that Trap Trix is able to be a back row deck that isn't just all about control, but of course it does also still have that control aspect. Yeah, cool deck. Just think it's been, in the same place it's been for a while, which is rogue bordering on tier 3, which again is a pretty good place to be. Like, even though that's lower on the tier list, there's, just think about how many archetypes are in Yu-Gi-Oh! And how much worse it could be. Yeah, no, I think that's a pretty good spot for a Trap Trix. Phantom Knight, excuse me. Ooh, let me take another sip of water here. Okay, Phantom Knight. I've put Phantom Knight in tier 3 in the recent past, but I don't know if I can keep it up there really anymore. I think on the last tier list, I probably put it on Rogue too. I think it's probably similar to Adamancipator in terms of its power level. I'll even put it a little bit higher than Adamancipator, actually. Yeah, that feels good. Yeah, I mean, the Terratop and Adventure unhits have definitely been very, very kind to Phantom Knight. But again, in this meta, we're definitely seeing like a sheer power level difference from stuff like up here to stuff like down here. But that doesn't mean the stuff down here is not worth playing. And certainly once Snake Eye gets addressed, everything like, especially in Tier 3 and Rogue, is going to feel like so much better to play. And I'm a little bit optimistic that the release of the selection pack early recently with Bonfire in it means that Snake Eye will get addressed sooner rather than later. It was also addressed on a recent OCG list, so I'm optimistic for that. We'll end up seeing what happens on the next ban list, I suppose. So, okay, next deck we're going to talk about is Dinomorphia. Dinomorphia is, for me, in a very, very similar spot to Trix, right? Just in terms of the fact that it's, you know, Rogue bordering on Tier 3, but I'm going to put this one on the Tier 3 side of the spectrum there, towards the lower end of it. Dinomorphia has just so many really solid things it can be doing in terms of just its own plays, but also disruption. Ferret Flames is a really, really good card in general, but especially, like, because I believe that card shuffles back into the deck, or it doesn't put into the graveyard. If I recall correctly, Ferret Flames, wherever it sends those cards, I don't remember if it banishes it or shuffles them back into the deck. I think it's the latter, but stuff, if you can keep your opponent off of the graveyard in general, that's just really, really good in this meta. So, not only that, of course, Dinomorphia has its own disruption in terms of Rexterm and the counter traps, and has just a very solid game plan going on. It's also pretty splashable with a lot of different stuff, so that's definitely a pretty big bonus for it. I think, yeah, looking at Dinomorphia next to Mikanko, they definitely feel pretty similar in that regard, and also in terms of their power level. I'm pretty satisfied putting these here. Tearlament. So Tearlament, ooh, I gotta think about this one for a second. I'm going to put Tearlament at the very top of Tier 3, but I could see it being a Tier 2 deck right now as well. I've noticed that Tearlament has been seeing a pretty big surge in play lately. I wonder if that was from transaction rollback, making a lot of trap-based Tearlament variants viable, and people trying that out. Be it Tearlament Labrynth, or the, like, Needlebug. Well, I guess to be fair, you would use Needlebug Nest in about, you know, any trap-based Tearlament deck. You can do potentially some what are they called? The things, Paleozoic stuff with them. There's a lot of cool things you can do with Tearlament right now. Tearlament, yeah, it's really interesting how this deck is kind of more a mill. Well, I was going to say it's more of a mill facilitator, but that's not even necessarily true, because, like, pure Tearlament, I think, is probably still the best variant of it right now. And it's really not that different from how it's been in the past. Really, I mean, I think if anything else, it's just a testament to how strong the Tearlament cards are, that they've been hit so harshly, for good reason, for so long, and yet we're still, like, we've never seen this deck ever dip into Rogue. I think there was one tier list where I put Tearlament in Rogue, but even then, that's just because people stopped playing the deck. It was right after Purrely got banned, and people were like, oh, this deck is bad now. But in hindsight, like, people who were saying that were definitely wrong. I don't remember, like, I was kind of, like, on the fence about it, if I recall correctly, but I didn't commit to saying Tearlament is good, so I'll say I was wrong in that regard as well. I think we were all kind of wrong about how bad Tearlament was when Purrely first got banned. Yeah, no, in my opinion, this deck's power level has never been down to Rogue, and even right now, I still almost want to put it in Tier 2, but I'll leave it up here at the top of Tier 3. Vanquish Soul. Vanquish Soul, I think, is a very, very good Tier 2 deck. I don't know, this is where my own personal bias comes in, because, like, I initially placed it here below Mathmech, but I think that's because I just have more experience with Mathmech. If I'm being honest with myself, like, if we look at Untapped's numbers, but not even just Untapped's numbers, like, if you go over to Master Duel meta and then look at tournament tops too, like, you see about as much Vanquish Soul, if not a little bit more than Mathmech. So yeah, like, I think I'll put Vanquish Soul up here. It might even end up being the top of Tier 2. Vanquish Soul just has a lot going for it in general, but even in this meta too, right? It can play Shifter. Any deck that can play Shifter is definitely at a premium right now. We have seen that with Kashtira, and we're gonna see it with other decks here on the tier list as well. But not only that, Vanquish Soul it plays very, very well into like literally every hand trap. Maxi, Ash Blossom, Valor, Imperm, Droll. It has lines that it can play through and around just about every single one of those. And just, again, on top of being a good control deck in general. Like, I think Vanquish Soul, is... I don't know, I was going to say it's definitely the best control deck, but we'll have another pretty significant one to talk about as well. But... I don't know. I'm not willing to say that deck is better than... Well, I don't know. We'll see. We'll see. But, actually, that'll be pretty interesting to figure out where Labrynth ends up being. But anyway, it's one of the best control decks of the meta. I'm willing to say that. It's very, very good. And again, with the ability to play Shifter, plays very well against Sekai, which is always going to be a huge plus in this current meta. So I have Prime Heart representing Mannadium, which I always do, even though you don't actually play Prime Heart in its own deck, which is kind of funny. I think for me, Mannadium is going to be the bottom of tier 2, where it feels a lot like Tearlament, where it's not, and also I guess to an extent Mathmech as well, where it's not up here because it has a good Snake Eye matchup per se, but it's just, I think it's lower tier 2 just because of the power level of the deck. That's just where it's at. And lest we forget that the level 4 Vysis monster, not Umbraterra, that's a Synchro, Samsara I think it's called, was leaked to be out in the next selection pack, and that'll be another boost for Mannadium as well. A level 4 Vysis, you can normal summon it. It has its own summon effect, if I recall correctly, and it's also treated as Vysis not only on the field but also in the graveyard, which is huge for summoning Vicious Astrolaud without having to actually banish your Vysis from the yard. So yeah, it'll definitely be a pretty big boost for Mannadium. Definitely do not expect to see this deck going anywhere. In fact, I would expect to see more of it in the relatively near future. Exosister, yeah, I mean, of course, this is a meta where the top deck is fairly graveyard reliant, which makes Exosister fairly good. Also just a good deck in its own right, of course, as well. But where do I want to put it on the tier list? I'm going to put it in upper rogue. I'll put it above Phantom Knight. Yeah, I'll put it here. That feels like a fine spot for Exo. Yeah, I mean, Exo's strength in the format, as always ever, just depends on how graveyard dependent it is. And in Tearlaments meta, we even saw it creep up to tier 3, debatably even tier 2, just because of how good of a matchup that is. But Snake Eye does also have some in-engine ways to deal with the Exo stuff as well. Thinking of like Courier Card of Incarnate and the Subversion, and just generally plays better against the, or well into rather, the Disruption, which is why I don't think Exo is quite tier 3, but it is pretty close for sure. Stun. Stun might actually, here's the thing, I usually put Stun lower in the rogue tier, the rogue end of the tier list, but I will say Stun is better in this meta, I think, than it has been recently. And that might sound really weird, like why would Stun be any better against this best deck as opposed to previous best decks, but if you think about where Stun is right now in terms of the number of floodgates and what kind of floodgates it has access to, a lot of Stun decks have had to kind of turn towards using Necro Valley, Dimensional Fissure, and Macro as floodgates, even though there are definitely decks out there that are not hurt by those cards, which kind of makes it harder for Stun to be as good in general. However, again, when you have a very, very heavily, well, not very, very heavily, but a pretty decently heavy graveyard-focused deck as the top deck of the meta, that means that Stun's now relying on the Banish and Necro Valleys as floodgates becomes more viable, because stuff like Skill Drain and Rivalry and goes in, and there could be only one or all at one, it kind of has to use those sort of floodgates. Summon Limit as well. So where do I think Stun goes? Again, I usually put it in lower rogue. I'm gonna put it in, okay, let me like compare it to like these other rogue decks. Like, Do I think stun is better than Purrely right now? Probably, yeah. I think I'm willing to put stun here in upper rogue. I will say this is the meta where stun comes closest to being tier 3. And I've noticed that in TCG in particular, stun is really picking up steam. And I've seen more and more people saying that it's just actually a good deck in the meta for its ability to play against Snake Eye. So I think to an extent that also applies here as well. Okay, Superheavy Samurai. This is going to be another tier 2 deck. Not even for how it plays against Snake Eye, but just for being, like, good in general. I think I'll put it square in the middle. I'm going to put it a little bit below Mathmech. I think before Bonfire came out, I would have put it a little bit above Mathmech, but with the release of Bonfire, that does mean that we're going to see more Droll and Lockbird in the meta, because Droll and Lockbird is now actually pretty decent against Snake Eye, whereas before it did pretty much nothing, right? If you can Droll and catch them on the Bonfire, especially searching the Snake Eye Ash, then they won't be able to do plays like at all, right? Because you need to search Poplar off of Ash to do things. It's actually kind of like how Droll plays against Mathmech, where Droll is like situationally good, right? Like if you can Droll the Cynet mining or Small World search, then they just can't play pretty much at all. But if they don't start with that, then Droll might not be as useful. So with Droll being more of a thing, I think Superheavy Samurai has a little bit harder of a time, but not significantly more so than it was before. I'm gonna put it smack in the middle of tier 2, which I think is a good spot for it. Yeah, that looks pretty good to me. Rescue Ace. Oh, Rescue Ace. I think we are, yeah, the new support is actually in the leaks. So when that comes out, we'll definitely see a pretty big boost in power level for Rescue Ace. As it is right now, I'm going to put it among, like, Adamancipator or Purrely, like this power level. You just never see anybody playing Rescue Ace, which makes sense, honestly, because everyone just is waiting for that new support. God, I feel so bad for Rescue Ace mains, especially Sarah Hyde. Waiting so long for the Rescue Ace support, and it looks like we are finally about to get it here soon. So once that comes out, then I would definitely expect Rescue Ace to rocket out of Rogue. But for the time being, until we get it, it is going to be, I think, a mid-Rogue level deck. Speaking of decks that got new support, Unchained did get new support in the most recent selection pack. The Yama, as well as the Shavara, and as well as the Shy Yama, I think is the blue dog's name. All very good. All very, very good support for the deck. It have elevated it far above what it was before, which was, like, very much lower on the Rogue spectrum. Unchained used to be one of those decks where, like, I would call it one of those lower Rogue decks where, like, yeah, you could get a tournament top or master with it, but you would really, really have to fight. Not nearly as hard to do so now. But I think I'm going to ultimately end up putting Unchained here in the middle of tier 3. Just playing both with and against the deck, that's about where its power level feels. Unchained is one of those decks that feels very strong, but not particularly unfair, right? Like, the end board for the deck might not look very impressive, but it is better than it looks for sure. But just also in general, I will say that, like, yeah, I think very strong, but not particularly unfair is about the best way to describe Unchained. When I say unfair, I just mean as far as like crazy things that a deck can do, right? Like Superheavy Samurai's end board, for example, is like might not be the strongest thing you can do in the meta, but it feels really unfair when it goes off uninterrupted. It feels very, very difficult, nay impossible to fight through. A Rysar can feel like that a lot of the time. Mathmech's board can feel like that a lot of the time. Unchained's board, again, is good. I'm not saying it's bad, but when I think about facing off against an Unchained board that went off uninterrupted, I just have a lot of gas in my head. I kind of think to myself, like, yeah, there's a lot of decks I think that could reasonably power through that. So I think that's what, for me, puts Unchained in tier 3. I'm open to the idea of being wrong about this. Maybe we'll see by the end of the season that Unchained ends up being like a very, very solid tier 2 deck, and I would be totally fine with that. I think it's a really, really cool deck. This is just where I think that Unchained is at right now with the bit of experience I have playing with and against it, but it is only a bit, to be fair. So, okay, Labrynth. Ugh, I was talking about this before, and I mean, it's definitely going to be in tier 2. I'm just kind of trying to figure out where in tier 2 I want to put Labrynth. I think I'm actually willing to put it pretty high, like maybe even above Mathmech. Yeah, I think that's a good spot for it. Is it better than Vanquish Soul? I think is like the big question here, because you could definitely make an argument for this as well. Especially now that not only does Lab have transaction rollback from the last pack, now it also has Arias from the latest pack as well. A lot of people definitely consider, and if you look at popularity, Lab is definitely like the second most popular deck right now, if I recall correctly. So, yeah, I mean, it's very, very good, but is it the second best deck of the meta? I don't know. I think it's really close between, honestly, pretty much all of these tier 2 decks. I don't know, Mannadium definitely feels like it's a little, and Kashtira, these two definitely feel like they're a little bit weaker than these four, but these four, Vanquish Soul, Lab, Mathmech, Superheavy Samurai, I think you could put these in like any order here at the top of tier 2, just about any combination. I would not necessarily disagree with. Like, I could definitely see any of these being the best of the tier 2 decks. I think just going off of a win rate and popularity, I'm going to leave it like this, in the order of Vanquish Soul, then Lab, then Mathmech, then Superheavy Samurai. But again, I could see an argument for like just about any order here. P.U.N.K. P.U.N.K is fun. It's a very, very cool deck, but is it particularly strong right now? Even with the addition of Gold Pride, I don't think it has the strength in the current meta to get out of the Rogue tier. I'll put it about the same level as like, yeah, like Exosister, Rescue Ace, Purrely, Sky Striker, where it's a cool and fun deck to play, and if you decide to main it, even in this meta, which again, if you think of it as a tier 0 meta, that's the thing. A lot of people say, or like try to act like in a tier 0 meta only the top deck is viable. And while of course, yeah, this is definitely the undisputed, in my opinion, only tier 1 deck of the format, I don't think that it invalidates playing any other deck right now, especially right now, because again, I don't think Snake Eye is as strong as Tearlaments was when it was at its prime. And even back then, I think you could definitely get away with playing like rogue decks or something you cooked up, and still expect to do well. So, yeah, P.U.N.K, I think is just, I don't know, the more I think about it, like Red Resonator ended up falling pretty low here. I actually think Res Resonator is probably like up here in terms of power level. I kind of let that one slip a little bit. I think I'm fine with wherever everything else is, though. Yeah, alright. Floowandereeze has actually seen a pretty huge surgence in play. I'm really surprised this did not happen sooner. Again, decks that can easily play Shifter should be valued at a premium right now, especially if you're another deck that can, like Kashtira, potentially play stuff like Dimensional Fissure, and that kind of thing, as well as, of course, the Shifters there. Like, that's the thing about Vanquish Soul. Like, Vanquish Soul plays Shifter, but it definitely prefers not to play it under Shifter, like having all their stuff getting banished. So it's not like it can't go full on banished the same way Kashtira and Floowandereeze can. I think Flow is definitely a tier 3 deck. I'll put it at the bottom of tier 3. I can see an argument for it being a little bit above Dinomorphia, right? I think I'll do that. I like that. I do think Mikanko is probably a little bit better. Yeah, this is probably, I think, a pretty good spot for Floowandereeze here. Hero is just, as always as ever, just going to be in like upper to mid rogue. Hero is one of those rogue decks where if you started out playing Master Duel with a hero deck and just mained it up until this point, you're very much rewarded for doing so, not only in the skill you gained playing hero for that long, but hero is just one of those decks where it's always going to get more support, and it has gotten a lot of really relevant support over these couple of years here in Master Duel. Definitely a very, very good deck. Branded Despia. That's another tier 2 deck I forgot about. Oh my god, I actually totally forgot about Branded Despia. Kind of surprised I did, actually, because it is a pretty good deck. Although, I will say, as a lot of these other decks are starting to get more support, it does feel like it's a little bit harder for Branded to keep up. But do I think it's better than Superheavy Samurai? Like, I kind of want to put it down here, but this feels a little bit low. But at the same time, I kind of feel like these four are still a little bit better than branded. Maybe Mathmech is a little high. Maybe, like, we could do something like that. I don't even think Mathmech is high. Yeah, I'm going to leave it like this. This is where I think it is. Again, tier 2. I think Kashtira and Mannadium are definitely at the bottom, but I think otherwise, tier 2, you could just make an argument for them being in any order. But I think for me personally, that is the order I think they're in. Again, I think Branded just, like, not only does Branded, I think, have a little, like, I want to emphasize a very, very slight power level issue compared to other tier 2 decks. Some other tier 2 decks, but I think it's even more of a consistency issue. Just having, like, 60 card decks and also with only the one Branded Fusion, like, yeah, you have a lot of ways to get to it. And of course you have plays beyond Branded Fusion, but your plays are notably not as strong without it. And again, it can be a little bit difficult to find it sometimes. I think that's Branded's big issue right now. Of the issues that it has, again, it's still a mid to upper tier 2 deck. It is still very, very good in this format. I don't want to sound like, I feel like I sound like I'm calling it a bad deck, but I'm definitely not. Of course, nothing on here is bad. We've already established this. Naturia, mostly going to be the Runick variant, but there are non-Runick Naturia decks out there as well. I think it ends up being definitely better than other Runick variants for sure. Like, I'm willing to even put it like up here, more in like upper rogue. Yeah, that's a good spot for Naturia. Swordsoul 10E, I think is still a pretty solid tier 3 deck. I think I'll even put it, I don't know. I think that's a good spot for it. It does keep slipping. I will say, like, Swordsoul has managed to hang in there. Much like Tearlaments has actually never fallen down to the rogue tier, but it's like, it's getting close. It's getting closer and closer, I feel like, every day. That Swordsoul is eventually going to be considered a rogue deck. But for the time being, I'm more than happy to call it tier 3. And finally, Rika Sunavalon. This is going to be another one of those kind of like lower tier 3 decks. I think I'll put it actually below Dinomorphia. You really could call Rika Sunavalon a rogue deck, and I don't think you would be wrong for doing so. But, yeah, so that's where we're going to end up with our tier list. I'm just looking it over now. I think I like where everything is. Yeah, I do like where everything is. It's funny how, like, we see less decks than usual in Rogue and more in Tier 2 and 3. But again, I think that's a symptom of just there being one undisputed absolute best deck in this current metagame. Yeah, and I think now that I look over the decks again too, there really isn't anything that I would say is the same power level as Snake Eye right now. I think it is pretty firmly the best deck in the format. So yeah, that'll do it. That's my placement for the tier list for Season 28 of Master Duel. But of course, that selection pack will, I mean, it'll shake things up between tiers 2 and 3 with a bunch of new support coming out for decks again, like Purrely, like Rescue Ace and all that stuff. But until we see significant Snake Eye hits, like, I do think that Snake Eye is just going to be the undisputed best deck. When Fire King support comes out, if Snake Eye is still as strong as it is right now, then I think it would join Snake Eye in Tier 1. But to be fair, that's also Snake Eye Fire King, which is like, you know, it does use a good bit, not even decent, a very good bit of Fire King support, but it is still also a Snake Eye deck, so it's still Snake Eye dominating the meta for sure. Definitely let me know what you think in the comments below. Again, even if you disagree, as long as you're not rude about it, because that's not fun. I think discourse is fun, so definitely let me know what you think of the tier list here and where you would put things. But I think that's going to do it for now, so let's move to our outro. Hey everybody, thank you so much for watching all the way to the end of the video. That means a lot to me. It's also a great way to support the channel, so thank you very much in that way as well. If you're interested in supporting the channel in other ways, like the very special patrons that I am thanking here, you can do so by checking out some of the links in the description. One of those goes to the Patreon, where you can join these fine folk and support the channel that way. I do post daily content over on Patreon, so you do get something for supporting supporting there. And if you're interested, I also have a coaching tier option as well. Details, again, will be on Patreon in the link below. Also in the description, linked below, is my Twitch page where I stream a few times a week. You can go ahead and check that out, follow or subscribe over there if you ever want to catch me live. You'll also find my second YouTube channel if you feel like subscribing over there to watch some of the Twitch VODs as well as some additional non-Yu-Gi-Oh related content that I make over there. Again, any of those links you want to check out is all a great way of supporting. But again, even if you don't do that, just watching was also a fantastic way to support. And once again, I have to thank you so very much. But in any case, this is Hexlex. I'm going to be signing out, and I'm hoping you have a fantastic day.